And now we have the linguistics. So linguistics, it is the study of language. This discussion will talk about the history of language, where it is started, and the different proponents of it. Okay, now so we have here the history of linguistics. So linguistics, it is written over the last 200 years. So during 1970s, linguistic historiography has become a specialized subfield, and histories of linguistics often copied from one another. Another thing is the history of linguistics as continuous and cumulative, and the history of linguistics has had to deal with the vastness of the subject matter. Another thing also is early developments in linguistics were considered part of philosophy, rhetoric, logic, psychology, biology, pedagogy, poetics, and religion. So, studying the history of linguistics is actually crucial for several reasons. One is understanding evolution of language, wherein the history of linguistics offers a foundation for understanding the development of various linguistic theories and approaches. So another thing also, it is the appreciation of diversity. In addition to that, the history of linguistics is essential for teachers to deepen their understanding of a language, culture, and society, and also to enrich their teaching practices. And now let's move on to the grammatical traditions. One thing is the Old Babylonian tradition. So this is the first texts were composed. Another thing is Sumerian, the language of religious and legal text was being replaced by Akkadian. And also, during those times, it emerged by about 1900 BCE and lasted for 2500 years. And most of texts are inventories, receipts, and rosters. So inventories of Sumerian nouns and Akkadian equivalents, it is the early text for use in the scribal school. So aside from the fact that grammatical traditions have played a vital role in language teaching, another reason is that it is the foundation of language structure. So grammatical traditions actually provide the foundational rules and structures of a language. Another thing is historical context, wherein it is the studying or the study of grammatical traditions actually provides insights into the historical development of a language. Now we have the language and Hindu tradition. So one thing is in Hindu, the Vedas, the oldest of the Sanskrit memorized religious texts, date from 1200 BCE. And the Sanskrit, it is their sacred language. Another thing is the Paninis, dated 500 BCE, so it is originated in comparison between versions called Padapata, word for word recitation, and Samhitapata for continuous recitation of divine origin. So Sanskrit is the language that traditionally associated with the Hindu religious and cultural tradition. Sanskrit also is one of the oldest languages in the world, and it is considered sacred in Hinduism. So many religious texts, including Vedas, are written in Sanskrit. For grammar rules in Hindu tradition, so their rules devised for comparison and for checking textual accuracy and technical methods of grammatical description. Another thing is Katyayana's and Patanjali's rule of interpretation and commentary in this tradition are significant. They considered that grammar was the most scientific of the sciences in India. Let us proceed to Greek grammatical tradition, owes its origin to language change that was developed by schoolmasters, so known only from later writings of philosophers. So one philosopher is Homer. He is works were basic in early Greek education and important in the school curriculum. So in school grammar, we have Plato, Aristotle, and Stoics. So the Greek grammatical or Greek grammar serves as a foundation for the study of linguistics and language structure. So by learning Greek grammar, students develop a deeper understanding of grammar concepts, syntax, and linguistic analysis, which can be applied to the study of other languages. Themes in the ancient Greek. So one is origin of language, second parts of speech, and the third one is relation between language and thought. So themes of importance in the Greek tradition included the origin of language, the parts of speech, the relation between language and thought. So the relation between the two aspects of word signs, whether form and meaning, are connected by nature or purely by convention. Okay, now we have the nature versus convention in Greek grammatical tradition. So it it is accounted for the relationship between words and their meaning. Okay, so nature, it is the first words supposedly imitating the things that they name, while convention, it is the usage or naming whether of human divine or human alone. So the study of grammar and communication, the linguistic variety, the language evolution, and language acquisition are all impacted by our understanding of the interaction between nature and convention. So understanding this will actually facets or will help us better comprehend how language develops and operates in human cultures. So some philosophers, we have Aristotle. So he was favored convention over nature, while Stoics, okay, so language originated in nature. So they have different beliefs, concepts, and ideas. All right, for Greeks, so we have morphology. It is the word structure and creation of the structure of words that refers to etymology. So for Plato, Plato's term equated with the modern categories such as noun and verb, and also it is equally had shades of subject and predicate and topic and comment. So Plato's division of the sentence into name and adherence, an example where the interpretation of the past has been based too much on present understanding. Okay, next we have the Roman linguistics. So Roman grammarians also did not treat syntax, only parts of speech. Rather, morphology dominated in an approach that focused on noun declensions and verb conjugations. Next, we have the Arabic grammatical tradition. So the Arabic language was sacred and immutable as enshrined in the Quran. So the system of inflectional endings was believed to be proof of the symmetry and logical calmness of the language. So no one was acknowledged in formal Arabic after the 18th century. So the Hebrew linguistic tradition actually began with concern for establishing the correct Hebrew text of the Old Testament. All right, for early Christians, so writers returned to the philosophical themes of Aristotle and the Stoics, and also the teaching of Roman grammarians were mixed with folk views in a Christian frame, and the origin of languages was also of natural interest to the multilingual early Christian world. So the hypothesis that Hebrew was the original language from which all others sprang became predominant. So the linguistic study of the languages used in early Christian texts, along with their translation, interpretation, and theological implications, is a rich area of research for scholars that are interested in the intersection of language, culture, and religion in the early Christian period. Now we have the rise of universal grammar. So grammarians followed Aristotle's view that scientific knowledge is universal or general and applies to all subject matter including grammar. And semantic analysis came to dominate Europe for the next 4 centuries. And while Abelard's Dialectica systemized logic as expressed through the structure of ordinary language, so building on Aristotle and placing logic at the highest level of contemporary science. So another thing is Robert Kilwardby insisted on the universal nature of grammar, so a concept that is fully developed by Roger Bacon. Alright, so Roger Bacon is famous for his statement that grammar is substantially one and the same in all languages, although it may vary accidentally. So, speculative grammar developed. So, with concern for the notion of modae significandi, so it means ways of signifying. So the grammarian's job was to explain how the intellect had created a system of grammar. So in the 14th century, teaching grammars began to compete with the scholastic commentaries, and the modistic approach faded. So in medieval manuscripts, the inflectional paradigms were explicated or annotated with forms from the vernacular languages. Now we have the rise of comparative method. So information on languages from Africa, Asia, and America became available in the form of word lists, grammars, dictionaries, and religious texts. So from the catalogs of languages and people in Genesis, inventories of known languages of the world has actually successively fitted into the biblical framework, usually placing Hebrew at the head between the 3rd and 17th centuries. So from the 15th century onward, etymology had been shifting away from its sense in classical antiquity of unfolding the true meaning of words towards a historical search for earlier stages in languages and the origin of words. So the comparative method in linguistics actually refers to a systematic approach that used to analyze and establish relationships between languages by comparing their structural features. So the rise of the comparative method actually revolutionized the field of linguistics by introducing introducing a systematic and rigorous approach to studying language relationships, historical development, and linguistic diversity. Okay, next we have the Scythian hypothesis and the notion of Indo-European. So one is Josephus and early Christian writers took them to the descendants of Japhet, and the Scythian linguistic hypothesis emerged from these notions. So various proposals attempted to identify Scythians with different language groups of Europe and Asia. Okay, next we have Sir William Jones. So Jones is usually credited with founding comparative linguistics and discovering the relationship among Indo-European languages. So another we have Sir Jacob Grimm. His Grimm's Law. It was a major milestone history of Indo-European. So it recognized the importance of sound correspondences as evidence of family relationships, saying his law had important consequences for the history of the language and the validity of etymology, and that provides sufficient evidence for the kinship of the languages involved. So by recording, analyzing, and documenting these languages, actually contribute to the preservation of linguistic diversity and cultural heritage. All right, next we have the Neo-Grammarians. So the Neo-Grammarians are a group of younger scholars who antagonize the leaders of the field by attacking older thinking and loudly proclaiming their own views. So we have Karl, August, Hermann, and Hermann Paul and others. So their slogan is sound laws suffer no exceptions. So every sound change in as much as it occurs mechanically. So it takes place according to the laws that admit no exception. So here, linguists, the neo-grammarians play a crucial in studying, analyzing, and understanding language and its various components. Okay, next we have the philosophical psychological approaches. So, in the 19th century, there was a clash between views of linguistics as a physical science and humanities. So, linguists attempted to place linguistics in the natural sciences, so denying any value for the humanistic intellectual orientations. However, in the 18th century, interest began to concentrate on the origin of differences in languages and cultures, and this led to the idea of the particular genius of each language, and through this, to a typology of languages viewed as descriptive and historical. All right, in addition to that, so in the same approach, Franz Bopp's comparative grammar actually contributed significantly to growing interest in comparative grammar and philosophical, psychological, typological, evolutionary outlook. So this view that modern languages are but dim reflections of their more perfect progenitors was called glottogenic. Okay, next we have the rise of structuralism. So it claims that the various elements of a language, specifically the sounds, words, meanings, present themselves as a system and can be identified through explaining the relations to other elements of the same language. So in linguistics, in structuralism, um, phoneme, it is the smallest unit of speech, so it distinguishes one word or word element from another, and that is why in structuralism they focus on phonetics because their intention is to teach the children specifically in pronouncing or uttering a such word. All right, so we have here some linguists. So when we have Sir Ferdinand, so he emphasized the synchronic study of language structure and how linguistic elements are organized into the system of each language. So his linguistic sign is a union of the signifier. So the form, sound, and the signified, the meaning function. So the particular form and the particular meaning in individual signs are arbitrarily associated with one another. So, in his view, linguistic entities were considered members of a system and were defined by their relations to one another within that system. Okay, so we have the Prague School and its antecedents. So we have Courtenay's thinking actually was instrumental in the development of the notion of the phoneme. So he and his students contributed that terms morpheme, grapheme, distinctive feature, and alternation. So his thinking actually survived most vividly through linguists whom he influenced who became associated with the linguist circle of Prague. Next, we have Sir Franz Boas. He is the founder of American linguistics and American anthropology. So Boas believed that it is important to avoid preconceptions and to describe each language and culture in its own terms. So the notion of inner form became the core of Boas' view of ethnology and linguistics. So his view is revealed in his conception of the Handbook of North American Indian Languages. So as a morphological classification with the goal to reveal their morphological classification and psychological characterization. Okay, so Edward Sapir He published extensively in both linguistics and anthropology. And also, he wrote theoretical works, for example, on the phoneme. Next, we have Sir Leonard Bloomfield. His principal concern was to develop linguistics as a science. So the language is considered a milestone in linguistics. So the foundation of American structuralist linguistic thinking. In addition to that, um, okay, so prominent writers in linguistics actually play a multi-role in advancing the discipline through theory development. So the knowledge dissemination, its educational impact, the different critical analysis, the influence, legacy, and something interdisciplinary collaboration. So their works actually contributes to the ongoing evolution of linguistic scholarship and enhances also our understanding of the complexities of human language. Okay, next we have Sir Noam Chomsky and linguistic theory. So Chomsky is currently among the 10 most cited writers in all of the humanities. So the goal of a grammar is to account for the native speaker's competence, defined as what a native speaker knows. So actually, Chomsky focused on syntax also. So the aim of linguistics is to go beyond the study of individual languages to determine what the universal properties of human language in general and to establish the universal grammar that accounts for the range of differences among human languages. Okay, next we have the typology. So sometimes it is called functional typological approach. So it is the classification of languages according to linguistic traits and the comparison of patterns across languages. So the typological approach actually attempts to explain the patterns through appeal to language function in cross-linguistic comparison. Okay, next we have the generative grammar, so the rule systems for describing sentence structure. Let us first define grammar. Grammar is the structural foundation of our ability to express ourselves. In linguistics, grammar provides a framework for comprehending the composition, arrangement, and operation of language systems. So it offers perceptions into how language or how languages are put together, how meaning is expressed, and how language functions to facilitate communication. Generative grammar, as proposed by Noam Chomsky, is a theoretical framework that aims to uncover the underlying rules and principles that govern the structure of sentences in natural languages. Okay, we have the tenets of generative grammar. One is grammar should be descriptive, not prescriptive. So, in a way that descriptive grammar is preferable to prescriptive grammar because it promotes a more varied, inclusive, and sophisticated understanding of language. And also, descriptive grammar encourages linguistic inquiry, cultural appreciation, and societal acceptance of all languages or language variants by concentrating on how language is actually used in practice. The second, grammars should characterize competence, not performance. The third, grammars should be fully explicit. Fourth, linguistic analysis should be general. The theory of grammar should make universal claims. The last one, grammars should be psychologically relevant. So its significance reveal the generative mechanisms and underlying laws that underlie the originality and complexity of human language.
We are now in the common formal elements. In linguistics, common formal elements refer to recurring patterns and structures found in languages. These elements help organize and convey meaning in communication. Some examples of common formal elements include Phonology, the study of sounds in language and how they are organized. Morphology, the study of word formation and structure. Syntax, the study of sentence structure and grammar rules. Semantics, the study of meaning in language. Pragmatics, the study of how context influence language use. Since Chomsky's important work in the 1950s, various grammar theories have been developed that align with the concepts discussed earlier. Most of these theories can be seen as expansions of context-free grammar, also known as the CFG. The three common formal elements are context-free grammar or CFG, transformational grammar, other enhancements to CFG. CFG starts by categorizing words based on how they change in form, where they appear in sentences and their meanings. The classic categories like noun and verb, originating from ancient Greek grammar studies, are commonly used alongside new categories specific to different theories. Another key idea in CFG is grouping words into phrases, which are then combined into larger phrases. This structure is often shown using a tree diagram to represent the organization of a sentence. Phrases are identified by their distributional patterns and usually function as semantic units as well, like words. Phrases are generally classified into categories. Phrases like words are grouped based on how they are used and often convey meaning together. They are categorized into groups like noun phrase, which is presented by NP, the verb phrase, V or VP, and prepositional phrase or PP, based on the main words in those phrases known as lexical heads. For example, in the sentence, the big red apple, the words the, big, and red from the noun phrase form the noun phrase describing the apple. There are two parts of CFG. A lexicon. A lexicon is a list of words along with their grammar categories. A set of rules for the form A. Alpha show how a phrase category A can be made up of different word or phrase categories. These rules, known as phrase structure rules, indicate how phrases are constructed. In a CFG, there are specific phrasal categories called initial symbols that can function as standalone sentences in the language. Typically, a simple CFG has one initial symbol, often denoted as S. For example, in a CFG for English, the initial symbol S represents a sentence. Now let's have the transformational grammar. To address the limitations of CFG, Chomsky proposed using a sequence of trees for each sentence instead of just one. The first tree in the sequence, generated by a CFG, will be called the base, while the following trees are created by applying specific rules known as transformations to modify the trees in precise manner. For instance, to explain tag questions and imperatives, We will focus on sentences without negatives, with pronouns as subjects and auxiliary verbs. A straightforward transformational grammar for these cases include a base grammar and specific transformations. Optional elements and rules are shown in parentheses. Transformation rules show how one form can change into another. For example, in a transformational grammar, a sentence like "You are coming" can be transformed into a tagged question. You are coming, aren't you? Example from Figure 7 transforms simple declarative sentence trees into tagged sentences by adding a contracted negative and copying the subject. For example, in Figure 8, changes declarative sentences starting with "you will" into imperatives by removing these words and their associated notes. According to this approach, sentence from Figure 4 is created from the same base tree as "you will close the door" by applying the two transformations in the specified order. In both transformational and non-transformational generative theories, improvements to basic CFG have been made. One early enhancement was adding a semantic aspect. The meaning intended in a sentence affects its acceptability, blurring the distinction between syntax and meaning analysis. For example, the addition of a semantic component to generative theories helps explain how the intended meaning of a sentence impacts its structure and acceptability. The information in sentences 9a and 9b is all about how the words myself and me, or the pronouns myself and me, are used. The difference between sentences in 9c and 9d is mostly related to the meaning of the words. However, there's one main rule that applies to both situations. When you have a structure like NP1 to the verb followed by NP2, the word N2 can be a reflexive pronoun ending in self or selves only if it refers to the same person as your first noun phrase. This rule will be explained in more detail later on. For now, it shows how the meaning of words plays a role in the rules of grammar. In generative grammar, there has been a development known as non-atomic category labels for words and phrases. What's this non-atomic category labels for words and phrases? For instance, in the mini grammar mentioned in Figure 6, the categories aux, or which represents auxiliary rather, and the, or the verb, are treated as a separate categories, much like the noun and the verb are distinct. However, what these grammar labels as aux has typically been viewed as a type of verb. This interpretation can be understood when looking at the word have. For example, in a sentence like "we have won," in Figure 6, it would be classified as an auxiliary. Think of, think of this sentence. We have won, haven't we? On the other hand, sentence like "we will have fun" in Figure 6, it would categorize have as a verb of "we will have fun, won't we?" In generative grammar, non-atomic category labels refer to categories that are not indivisible or atomic, meaning they can be broken down into smaller parts. These labels are used to classify words and phrases based on their internal structure and syntactic properties. Here are some examples of non-atomic category labels. We have the noun phrase or NP, verb phrase or VP, prepositional phrase or PP, adjective phrase, determiner and the determiner phrase. In this part of my topic, we will talk about what is a feature. In linguistics, a feature is a characteristic or attribute used to classify words or phrases based on specific properties. Features are associated with multiple values that correspond to different properties exhibited by the words or phrases being analyzed. Let's delve deeper into this concept using the example provided. Nouns can be classified into different subcategories, such as proper nouns and common nouns, as well as singular or plural nouns. Representation with features. To represent the classification of nouns using features, we can posit two features. We have the common and the number. What is a common feature? This feature distinguishes between proper nouns and common nouns, while the number feature distinguishes between whether a noun is singular or plural nouns. How do we apply this? When analyzing a specific noun such as cat, we can assign values to the features. For its common feature, this noun is a common noun, while its number feature, the noun cat, is singular. What's the significance? Using features to classify words or phrases allow linguists to systematically organize and describe the structure of language. It provides a framework for understanding how different linguistic elements relate to one another based on their shared properties and characteristics. Then the two features can be used in representing the categories of some representative words as follows. So we have the nouns child and children. All of the feature structures in this figure might also have something like the POS noun, where POS stands for part of speech. Decomposing categories into features in linguistics offers several advantages, one of which is the ability to efficiently reference classes of categories by specifying key features. Let's explore this concept further. Example: when referring to all singular nouns using this feature specification, we can focus solely on the essential properties of the category, noun, and singular while leaving other properties unspecified. This selective specification allows for a concise and targeted reference to a specific subset of nouns. Some phenomena studied by generative grammarians. The literature of generative grammar is full of detailed examinations of myriad syntactic phenomena in a wide variety of languages. Most analyses depend on assumptions that are controversial. Nevertheless, the field has made numerous genuine discoveries. Although different schools of thought employ disparate formalisms and terminology, we know far more about the structure of language than we did in the 1950s, thanks to research in generative grammar. This section provides an overview of two areas in which generative grammarians have made clear progress. First is the binding principles. In linguistics, binding principles refer to a set of rules that govern the relationship between pronouns and their antecedents within a sentence. The principles help explain how pronouns such as he, she, it, or they are linked to a specific nouns or noun phrases in a sentence. There are three main binding principles in linguistics. One is Principle A, or the anaphor binding. Principle A deals with the binding of reflexive pronouns such as himself, herself, or themselves. It states that a reflexive pronoun must be bound by its local antecedent within the same clause. In other words, the reflexive pronoun refers back to a noun phrase in the same clause. Second is Principle B, or pronominal binding. Principle B pertains to the binding of non-reflexive pronouns like he, she, or they. It states that a non-reflexive pronoun must be free and not bound by its local antecedent within the same clause. The non-reflexive pronoun typically refers to a noun phrase outside its local clause. Principle C, or the R expression binding. Principle C focuses on the binding of R expressions, which include definitions, descriptions, or proper names. It specifies that an R expression must not be bound by any element within its local domain. R expressions are allowed to be different entities within the same sentence. The examples in Figure 9 illustrates that English has two different types of pronouns, namely reflexives, for instance, self, and we transform it to selves, and non-reflexives, while myself and me both refer to the speaker as does I. The environments in which they can be used differ. In particular, consider the following contrasts. Letter A says, I support me, while letter B says, I support myself. C states, they support me, and letter B, they support myself. For examples in 13, letter A states, I don't expect them to me. Letter B, I don't expect them to support myself. Letter C, they don't expect me to support me. Or letter D, they don't expect me to support myself. In linguistics, binding principles explain how pronouns relate to the words they refer to. There are two main rules. For reflexive pronouns like himself, it must refer back to a word in the same sentence. For the non-reflexive pronouns like he, it should not refer back to a word in the same sentence. For example, for reflexive pronoun, he saw himself in the mirror. The reflexive pronoun himself refers back to he in the same sentence. For noun-reflexive pronoun, he saw him in the mirror. The non-reflexive pronoun him does not refer back to he in the same sentence. These principles are fundamental in linguistic theory and are widely studied in syntax and semantics. In simple terms, when we say antecedent, we mean a word that comes before and has the same meaning. The word local suggests that the word referring back to the antecedent should be too far away. Defining the exact distance for local in these rules can be challenging, as shown by examples like the following. Extensive research exists to elaborate on the fundamental concepts outlined in Principles A and B. While the specifics of these concepts are complex and diverse, what remains significant is that English is not unique in distinguishing between pronouns that require local antecedents and those that do not. Many languages exhibit similar patterns, where certain pronouns necessitate nearby antecedents while others do not. The definition of local may vary across languages, but the overarching similarities outweigh the differences. This observation challenges the expectation of languages having only one type of pronoun. Here's another example. This provides further evidence that imperatives should not be treated as having second-person subjects as in some level of analysis. Notice, incidentally, that the binding principles interact in an interesting way with the analysis of imperatives suggested in section 3.2, assuming that the principles are applied prior to the deletion of the word or the pronoun you. The principles correctly predict the following. Now let's go back to the context-free grammars. Context-free grammars help describe how words or phrases relate to each other closely in a sentence. However, some languages have structures where elements depend on each other even when they are far apart. An example in English is the WH questions. These are interrogative words used in interrogative sentences that require answers beyond a simple yes or no. They typically begin with words like who, what, where, when, why, or how. They are also known as WH words. These words serve as interrogative pronouns or adverbs, seeking specific information about the subject, object, time, place, reason, or manner of an action. In these WH questions, the relationship between the WH word and its associated information may span across various parts of the sentence, showcasing how linguistic elements can be interconnected despite their spatial separation. This feature of language highlights the complexity and flexibility of grammar, allowing for diverse structures and interpretations beyond simple linear dependencies. To illustrate this, consider the examples in Figure 16. In sentence in 16a, the verb rely necessitates a prepositional phrase starting with on or upon as its complement. In 16b, In 16b, even in a WH question where the prepositional phrase shifts to the beginning of the sentence instead of following the verb, the requirement for specific prepositions remains unchanged. Sentence C demonstrates that this connection between the verb and preposition remains intact even when numerous other elements are inserted between them. Remarkably, there is no restriction on the amount of extra text that can be included between the verb and preposition while maintaining this grammatical dependency. In questions with WH phrases, these phrases sometimes act as if they are in a different position than where they are placed. Normally, local connections such as preposition choice or verb agreement can exist between a WH phrase and elements that are distant in the sentence. The binding principles also illustrate this concept further. Consider the examples below. As you can notice, the dependency between verb and the number singular or plural, each subject is preserved, even when the subject is a WH phrase that is far away in the string of words rather. Here's another example. At first glance, so we have here the sentence, which dog do you think we saw scratch? So we have here the pronouns yourself, you, itself, and it. It referring to which dog. First glance, the dog mentioned in the question doesn't seem like the correct match for the reflexive pronoun itself, due to the words in between. Additionally, you cannot be the reference for the reflexive object itself in the context of scratching, despite its proximity. The relationship observed here aligns with the expectations of principles A and B if the dog were the subject in the sentence about scratching. The complex connections in language seen in phenomena like WH questions and binding principles highlight the adaptability and intricacy of grammar in different languages. Even when words seem far apart in a sentence, the links between them remain, demonstrating the diverse and nuanced nature of communication. By studying these connections, we gain a deeper understanding of how language works, emphasizing the richness of human interaction. Exploring these linguistic details reveals the depth and sophistication present in how we use and understand language. Thank you.